Welcome everybody. My name is Mark Federman, and I have the distinct pleasure and privilege of playing here at Adler, the Adler Graduate Professional School, in creating a brand new master's program in leadership and organization development and coaching. Well, for tonight, I'm going to take you through a little bit of some of the stuff that I've been playing with over the past couple of years. And so I warmly welcome you and invite you to open your minds. I'm going to introduce you to some wild and crazy ideas. And these are sort of a different way of understanding organization, understanding leadership, understanding the way we engage with one another. And indeed, it's all the sorts of thinking that we're bringing here to Adler Graduate Professional School. I'd like to ask you all a question before we begin. The science question. How many people here believe, by show of hands, how many people believe that the sun travels around the earth? Can I see a show of hands? The sun travels around the earth. Nobody. Okay, let's try this question. How many people here believe that the earth travels around the sun? Can I see a show of hands? Earth traveling around the sun. That's most of the people. Okay. And finally, how many people here believe, as it was once said to philosopher William James, that it's turtles all the way down? I see votes for the turtles. Turtles all the way down. Oh, come on. I usually get at least one or two turtle people. There we go. Thank you. I got news for you. The sun, the earth, and probably even the turtles don't care what you think. Right? Not at all. Because sun, earth, turtles, gravity, all that stuff, they are natural systems. And natural systems will do what they do, quite irrespective of what we think, of the models that we create to describe them, the language that we use to build those models. They just don't care. On the other hand, our human systems, our systems of governance, our systems of education and knowledge, our systems of business and commerce, our systems of organization and leadership care very much about what we think. They care about the models that we construct. They care about the language we use to build those models, the way we engage with that language. Because our models of human systems are not merely descriptive. They're also generative. In other words, the models we create generate the behaviors, the way we interact with one another. Those in turn reify or bring about the reality of those models that in turn structure the institutions of our society. It's always been this way. We go back about 3,000 years to Heraclean Athens, to ancient Greece. In that society, it was a primary oral culture. Primary oral culture, what that means is everybody was completely illiterate. Nobody could read or write a single word. And the reason they couldn't was because nobody had invented the phonetic alphabet yet, so there was no reading and writing, right? So all of these institutions of society, the way we think about the way we interact with one another, they're all conducted person to person, small group to small group, entirely by word of mouth. So we end up with city-states, right? But once you introduce the phonetic alphabet, you transform the city-state of Athens into the Roman Empire. Because, well, think about it. Imagine yourself that you're an emperor in a central location, let's say Rome, and you issue an edict. Someone with literate ability can listen to what you say, write that down on a scroll, hand the scroll to a charioteer, jumps on his chariot, rides to the far reaches of the realm, way over here, hands that scroll to somebody else who, if he also has literate ability, can reproduce the words that were said all the way back there in Rome without ever having heard them himself. I mean, that's magic, right? Truly magical. But something else gets transported along with the words of the emperor, and that is the proxy authority to carry out whatever those words say. So now we begin to have the concept of delegated action at a distance. Roman Empire. Roman Empire falls, and in its place rises the Holy Roman Empire, one of the greatest bureaucracies in all of human history, the Roman Catholic Church. Its leaders not only had literate ability, they had command of the capital W word of God on high. And in the eyes of the illiterate masses, who after all got all their knowledge about the world, what to do, how to conduct their daily affairs, all of that, they got that information, well, in masses. It was the first mass media. Sorry. The eyes of those illiterate masses, the leaders of the church, the Pope, the cardinals, the bishops, the priests, and the scribes, also inherited some of the power and proxy authority of you-know-who. And that's sustained until we come to 1455 with one of the greatest heretics of all time, a man by the name of Johannes Gutenberg. And his heresy was he printed the Bible on a movable type press. In doing so, he not only accelerated communications, I mean, a tenfold acceleration with the printing press. It took a scribe 20 years to write the Bible by hand. Gutenberg could do it in 2. So he not only made the Word of God economical, he made it transportable. So people could take the Word of God away from the authority of the church. They could take it out and read it in a field or under a tree somewhere. They began to develop their own ideas about what those words meant. They began to develop their own ideas about these issues of authority and power and the control and the institutions of the society. Now the society was becoming restructured by this new technology of mechanized print. This led to one of the greatest home renovations in all of human history, when Martin Luther took his hammer and nails and renovated the doors of the Wittenberg Church by nailing up his 95 Theses in the year 1517. Luther, questioning the sale of indulgences. You all know what indulgences are? Any good Catholics in the audience? Let me explain it. You know when you sin, you go to hell? Well, the church had this scheme that when you sinned, you could go to the church, pay them some money, and they would sort of absolve you of the sin, and you wouldn't go to hell, you just hang out in purgatory for a while. Consider it a Middle Ages protection racket where you could buy a get-out-of-hell-free card. So, Luther, questioning the sale of indulgence by the church, created a rift in the church and touched off 100 years of bloody religious wars. But at the end of it, we have the Enlightenment, the Age of Reason, the rise of the mechanized factory mentality, which gives us, of course, the Industrial Age. But in the meantime, what he did was he created these multiple, mostly secular institutions of authority and control. We have the two churches, Catholic and Protestant. We have institutions that convey knowledge authority. We call them universities today. And we have multiple, almost entirely secular institutions of mercantile and commercial authority we call companies. Each one had its own little hierarchy of control and authority, which of course gave us the factory model, the Industrial Age, and that marches us up to the door of modernity in the 20th century. There we go, 3,000 years of history in about 6 minutes. Can't get a better deal than that. So we think about sort of the industrial model of management, leadership, organizations. It was documented in the early part of the 20th century by 3 men. Frederick Winslow Taylor, Max Weber, Pompey Fayol. Taylor gave us principles of scientific management in 1911. That's 100 years ago, for those of you keeping score. Taylor said there were 2 classes of people. There were thinkers and there were doers. The thinkers don't do, and the doers don't think. They just do what they're told, right? He said that you should have all your workers follow the example of the best worker. And if everybody does that, they replicate the work of the best worker, then the whole organization will be really efficient and effective, right? This is the beginnings of what we now call best practices. So whenever you hear the word best practices, think, yeah, 100 years old, right? Nothing new, and certainly, most likely, obsolete today. Taylor also said that workers should be paid an incentive pay for piecework. You pay them a little bit, the more work they do, the more money they get, because as we all know, everybody is motivated by money. Frederick Taylor. Max Weber, a German sociologist, documented, some people think he created, but he didn't invent bureaucracy. That was done by the church way back when. Weber documented bureaucracy, and he said that bureaucracy is the most rational, and by rational he meant logical means of exerting control and domination over men. Of course, women didn't count back then. Domination over men. He said that you institute procedural rules. They create an iron cage of domination from which it is almost impossible to escape. And the reason for that is that those procedural rules create or eliminate human judgment from any sort of organizational decision. And of course, any of you who have ever had to deal with a government bureaucracy know exactly what I mean by eliminating human judgment from organizational decisions. Right? That's the function of a bureaucracy take the people who are thinking out. Henri Fayol, French engineer writing about the same time, beginning of the century. His work was translated into English just after the Second World War. He gave us 14 principles of management. He said that work should be divided. You have division of work. He said that if you have the responsibility to accomplish a particular task, you should also be given the authority to do what it takes to finish that task. He said that you should have a clear chain of command from the thinkers down to the doers, so that orders would flow in an orderly fashion down to the doers, and information about what's really going on would flow from the doers up to the thinkers so that they could make decisions, because it's the thinkers that have the exclusivity on making decisions in organizations. And he said that an individual's interest must be subordinated to the greater interest of the organization, and in exchange, the workers would be paid a fair remuneration, both as compensation for the work done and as an incentive, hearkening back to Taylor, as an incentive for being more efficient and effective. So Taylor, Weber, and Fayol, these triumvirate of classical management theory, documented really what I call the bureaucratic, administratively controlled, hierarchical, BAH or BA organization. And the interesting thing is, now 100 years later, we are still teaching this stuff in business schools. Every MBA program, there might be one or two exceptions, but every major MBA program around the world is based exclusively on the work of Taylor, Weber, and Fayol as foundational material. We gussy it up. We call it other names. We have all sorts of fun stuff. Well, for example, we go through the 20th century. I'll tell you how this unfolds. We move from the pure instrumentality of Taylor, Weber, and Fayol, and we add the learning from the social sciences. For example, in the early part of the 20th century, in the famous Hawthorne experiments, in the Hawthorne works of General Electric, just outside of Chicago, we discovered that if you pay attention to the workers and make them think that you like them, they'll work more efficiently and effectively. About halfway through the century, we began to realize that if you gave the workers a little more freedom, a little more control over the work that they do individually on a day-to-day basis, then they'll work more efficiently and effectively. About 3/4 of the way through the century, we began to realize that the workplace is not just sort of the instrumental, technical work that has to be done, but there's a sort of a social aspect to a workplace as well. And if you could combine the social with the technical, sort of a socio-technical system design sort of thing, then you'd have a workplace that was really efficient and really effective. And towards the last part of the century, we're getting into the 1990s now, we began to think of organizations as a bounded but open system, exchanging information with its environment, whether it's the regulatory environment, competitive environment, market environment, customer environment, exchanges information through the permeable boundary of this bounded organization. And if you could figure out the optimal structure of your organization that corresponded exactly to the contingencies of that environment, sort of a structural contingency thing, then your organization would be really efficient and really effective. I think you're detecting a theme here, right? Even the most contemporary discourses as we enter the 21st century, learning organizations, communities of practice, collaborative teams are almost always framed in the service of efficiency and effectiveness in organizations accomplishing the primary purpose of what I describe as a primary purposeful organization. Primary purposeful organization, that means the primary purpose of the organization is predominantly focused on the purpose to the exclusion of any other consideration. But think about the history. We did that history lesson. I did it for a reason. Every time we change the dominant way in which we engage with each other, dominant mode of communications, society has been turned upside down and inside out. We go from primary orality to phonetic literacy, Greece to Rome. We go from the manuscript culture of the church to the printing press, mechanization. So we go from the dominance of the church to the dominance of these other secular institutions. We've now just recently entered the fourth cultural epoch. This started in 1844 with Morse's demonstration of the telegraph. And so we should expect that society is in the process of being turned inside out and upside down. Anybody noticed any sort of weird stuff going on in society lately? Right? But this doesn't happen overnight. You don't have Morse going beep, beep, beep on the telegraph the next day we're buying books from Amazon, right? It doesn't happen that fast. It takes about 300 years for the transition to be complete. And by complete, what I mean is that people will just wake up one morning and they'll say, well, it's always been this way. It's human nature. It's just the way people are, right? We've always been like this. That's what I mean by complete. 300 years. So we're just like past the halfway point, which was 1995. 1995? That was 151 years in the 300-year transition. 1995 was the year of the Netscape IPO and the internet, like all of a sudden, right? So it's break boundary. But everybody just wakes up. They say, my gosh, how fast things have changed. Well, they've been changing that fast. We just haven't noticed. But now that we've noticed, we know that there's some really interesting stuff going on. And we should expect, if we think about the 20th century, we should expect that the 20th century is a time of transition. So let's go back to our sort of management leadership stories. We should expect that there is a discourse, and discourse is just a fancy word for storytelling, group of storytellings, and who gets to tell the story. So there should be a discourse that is an extension of the old industrial age thinking. Very instrumental, very functional. We call the managerialist discourse. This is what you hear when you go to management school. And certainly the literature is filled with that stuff. We should also expect another parallel discourse that should begin to emerge through the 20th century that accounts for the nature and characteristics of this sort of new way of being that we're transitioning into. And if you go to the literature, you can actually tease apart two stories. So you get some people, early writers like Mary Parker Follett. You get Kurt Lewin. You get a whole bunch of really interesting and funky people later on as we're becoming more and more used to these changes that are beginning to become more and more evident. The first discourse, the first storyline, the managerialist storyline, gives us the BA organization that we know and love, but mostly don't. The second storyline, this one that is more humanistic, more relational in nature, gives us an organization that is more consistent with the way the world is, rather than the way the world was. Well, that sort of suggests an interesting question. What is this, how the way the world is? How is the world? I would suggest to you that we are living in a world of ubiquitous connectivity and pervasive proximity. Everybody is, or soon will be, connected to everybody else and all available information. This is ubiquitous connectivity. We will therefore experience the effects of being immediately next to, proximate to, everybody else and all available information. This is pervasive proximity. So our direct experiences of the world, especially for those of us who were born and socialized into the world where the internet never didn't exist, the Google never didn't exist, right? People who today are in their late 20s and younger. But even for those of us who have been sort of acclimatized and acculturated, we sort of adopt and adapt these new technologies, that our direct experience of the world is fundamentally different than the experience of the world of people who lived and did their work, say, in the middle part of the 20th century, in the latter part of the 20th century. We are living in this world of ubiquitous connectivity and pervasive proximity, and we have an organization that is consistent with ubiquitous connectivity, pervasive proximity. I use that expression a lot. Let me just abbreviate it to UCAP. UCAPP, ubiquitous connectivity and pervasive proximity. So one discourse gives us the BA organization, one discourse gives us the UCAP organization. Well, that raises another really, really interesting question. How can we tell the difference? Are there some attributes, some behaviors, some characteristics, the ABCs of organization? Isn't that cute? the ABCs of organizations that allow us to say, yeah, this one is more BA and this one is more UCAP. Is there that? Anybody? Does that sound like an interesting question to you? How do you tell the difference? It was an interesting question to me, and in fact, it was so interesting that that's what I did my doctoral research on, to answer that question. Can we tell the difference, and how? So I had the great good fortune and truly privilege to have 5 organizations volunteer to participate and play along with me. Let me tell you a little bit about them. I had, as one organization, it was a ministry of a government located somewhere in Canada. That's all I can tell you about them. As you might guess, they are the Uber-BA organization. They are so BA, they invented BA stuff that Max Weber and Frederick Winslow Taylor and Henri Fayol never dreamed of in their wildest dreams. They reinvented BA. It was quite amazing to see that government. I had a division of a Fortune 50 corporation based in the United States. So they were pretty BA. So now we have like private sector, public sector, private sector, not for profit, government, like whatever, and definitely for profit, right? We had like government and corporation, so 2 different ones, both BA. Not a surprise. I then had an organization that was a small company just out of startup mode, so they would sort of consider themselves a small company. During my work with them, they grew from 12 people to over 20, about 21, 22 people during the time of my study. They they deliver web-based business services to small and medium enterprises. So they're new, they're cool, they're hip, they're online. They have a foosball table. They do all sorts of funky titles and like really cool, man. They went from being more UCAP to more BA during the course of my study. Fascinating to see that. That was really fascinating. Then I had an ad agency. They were based in Toronto. I had an ad agency in New York. About 100 people. They've gone through a couple of like reincarnations of their organization, but they've been around for about 20 years in one form or another. So medium length, medium size, about 100 people. Successful company, and they had just undergone a transition from BA to UCAP. So for-profit corporation in the capital of capitalism, New York City, going from BA to UCAP. Fascinating again. And then I had a social justice NGO based in Ottawa, core group of about 15 people. But when I sort of say who's like really involved with them and who's like really a member of this organization, their numbers span thousands around the world. But their core group is 15. So that's sort of interesting. And as you might expect, social justice NGO run explicitly on feminist principles, the archetype of UCAP. And so here we have this collection of 5 organizations, big, small, young, old, online, offline, private sector, public sector, for-profit, not-for-profit, all the different ways we slice and dice organizations. And we had BA and UCAP quite irrespective and independent of any of these. So that's really an interesting one, which gives me the great freedom to throw out all the old typologies and say none of it applies when we're looking at 21st century stuff. The other cool thing, the other cool observation was, here we had the social justice NGO, and we had an ad agency in New York, and both of them are UCAP. That's also cool. You couldn't have 2 organizations that are more different from each other and yet more the same when we look at it through this lens. Again, really interesting. So how do we distinguish? In the research, I found that there were 7 distinguishing characteristics between BA and UCAP organizations. And so the ones I found were change, the way they deal with change, the way they deal with coordination, the way they do evaluation, the way they, I'm going to miss one, I'm sure if I don't, evaluate impetus, the motive force of the organization and motivation within the people. As you might expect, power dynamics, very different between the 2. Sense making, how they make sense of their world, both inside and outside the organization, and their view of people, how they consider people. This is a cool one. Traditionally, BA organizations consider people as HR. What's HR? All together now? Human resources. UCAP organizations consider their people as a different HR. Human resourcefulness. Let me tell you about some of these and characterize these 2 organizations. Let's start with change. I'm not going to do all of them, I'll just do a few. Change. BA organizations hate change. They love stability. They love predictability. They love people to make a plan, execute the plan, accomplish the objectives. If you don't accomplish the objectives, you execute the plan. They want to make sure that what is supposed to happen always happens the way it's supposed to happen. And whenever you have these unavoidable consequences, you institute a new procedure so that this will never happen again. You've all heard that, right? This will never happen again. UCAP organizations realize that this always happens again. Stuff always happens again. The world is emergent. The world is complex. We cannot predict. We may be in charge, but we certainly aren't in control. We cannot predict these things. And so they are designed to accommodate. They don't even consider change. They just say, this is the way of the world. It's constantly in flux. And so what they do is they have very sophisticated systems for environmental sensing. And these systems are called listening to your people. It's called a culture of inquiry, where everyone is mandated to question everything. Why are we making this decision? Why did you make that decision? Why are we doing this? Does this make sense? Does this still make sense? It made sense last week. Does it make sense this week? They hear from everybody in the organization, irrespective of their job, irrespective of their location, irrespective of their seniority. The CEO of the ad agency said that what she does is she invites different people to her strategy table. There are a few C-level managers, but not all. Everybody knows what C-level? The first couple of times I didn't know what that was. So like the chief whatever officer, right? C-level. So a few, but not all. A few directors, but not all. A few managers, but not all. A few workers, not all. A few interns, not all. Doing strategy in the corporation. And she mixes it up every 6 to 9 months. So she hears from a lot of different people, and I asked her, so why do you invite these college kids to deal with corporate strategy? And she says, because they're going to learn stuff in college that I never heard. They're going to get stuff at their their dinner table, their family table, from their parents that I need to know, and they bring in. And so diverse voices and diverse opinions to deal with this environmental sensing. In BA organizations, coordination comes from the top. It's top down. The leadership is rightly charged with creating the vision for the organization. That vision gets manifest as its mission and its purpose. That translates into the objectives of the organization that are then functionally decomposed according to the responsibilities of each division, and we divide it and divide it and divide it all the way down the hierarchy until you have individual tasks for each individual. And of course they're interdependent, so we have good coordination among the people. And each person is individually and personally responsible for accomplishing their responsibilities and accountable to the next level up. We roll all that up and they're accountable to the next level up and accountable to the next level up and accountable, etc. all the way up. That's how we do coordination. In a UCAP organization, they also have a vision and a purpose and all that stuff. That's not where they start. They start from their values. And it's not, it is the organizational values, but that's not even where it starts. It starts from the values that are brought by all of the members that collectively form the emergent values of the organization. Once you get the organizational values, well, it's easy to understand your purpose. And from there you can get your mission and your tasks and so forth. But because people are working from a place of their values, there's an interesting change in the dynamic that goes on. Think about it. If you yourselves are working from a place of your values, all you need to know is what's going on, and you can probably decide what you're doing. Right? So one of the key elements of coordination in these UCAP organizations is there's a wide socializing of information. Everybody knows everything that's going on, whether or not it directly applies to your function in the traditional sense. Because the more information you have, you can then decide what it is you need to do, and chances are it'll be the right decision. Not 100%, but then again, traditional organizations, how many decisions are 100%, right? And so people work from a place of individual autonomy and agency. But it's not just willy-nilly, go off and do what you do. There's also a culture of collective responsibility. What that means is that I cannot be successful unless you and you and you and you and all of you are successful as well, and vice versa. You can't be successful unless I'm successful. So this collective responsibility is done in an environment, contextualized in an environment of mutual accountability. In other words, I'm accountable to you, you're accountable to me, we're accountable to each other for our collective success. Well, this provides a really interesting dynamic. In conventional BA organization, we have to make sure that everybody's tasks are aligned with the overall purpose of the organization, because people are doing what we tell them to, not necessarily what they want to do. So we have to be checking up. We have to make sure that they get their job done. And so we create very complicated incentive plans in order to keep them aligned, right? Because as we know, everybody is motivated by money. So we have these very complicated incentive plans and, of course, disciplinary regimes to keep everybody in line. Contrast that with the UCAP organization. In the UCAP organization, when people are working from a place of their values, they're working towards their collective purpose, their individual purpose, their collective purpose. You treat them like adults, individual autonomy and agency, collective responsibility, all that stuff. You don't have to do as much checking up. You don't have to have the same sort of incentive plans. I mean, you got to pay people, of course. But what it means is you don't need as fat carrots or as big sticks to keep them in line. You don't have to check up, rather you check in. You check in to ensure that there are no impediments, because your impediment also impedes my success. And so we help each other as we check in to eliminate impediments, and the whole organization, ironically, is more efficient and effective by doing that. Now, when we think about the distinction between BA and UCAP organizations, we think about this construct that we've got the leadership creating the vision, the mission, the purpose, the tasks, aligning everything, compensation plans, all of that stuff. I mean, that's what leaders do, right? That's the function of leaders. That's the job of leaders in management. We know that. Vision, purpose, inspire people, motivate, create systems to do that. That's what leaders do. But wait a minute. Over here on the UCAP side, all that vision, mission, tasks, so on, those are distributed among all of the people, or in the processes that support the people. That raises another really, really, really interesting question. What is the role of a contemporary leader in a UCAP organization if it's not to lead in the conventional sense of the word? What is the role of a UCAP leader if it's not to lead? Fascinating question. What I found in my research is that UCAP leaders are what we call referent leaders. In other words, the UCAP leader is the person that everybody points to when you ask the question, so who inspires you? Who's creating the great place to work? Or who's really giving you the, gee, I want to come every day and be with that person? That's the referent leader. It could be her or him or those two people over there, irrespective of what their job might be. As one of my participants told me, this is from the ad agency, she said, anybody here could be a leader so long as everybody else agrees that they are the leader. Now, she was a leader in her organization. She was leading the infrastructure project to completely revamp and retool the workflow through the agency. So tactically and strategically critical, mission critical project. And her job function, she was an admin assistant. She was an admin assistant. People who are unfortunately considered way down on the totem pole, even though everybody knows admin assistants run the joint, right? But she was the referent leader because she had the skills and the capabilities and the insight and the knowledge and the ability to sort of get everybody together to actually be considered the leader for that infrastructure project. So they're emergent. Referent leaders are emergent. They're contingent on the situation. She may not be the leader in something else, right? In fact, in that project, the CEO was just one of the players. Didn't have any particular status in the context of this thing. So referent leaders, UCAP leaders, they invite the heterogeneous thinking that goes along with this environmental sensing that I mentioned. They enable UCAP-style coordination and collaboration. UCAP-style collaboration, I've got this really great project I'm really enthusiastic about. Who wants to help? Who wants to play? and people say, I've got some skills that I can contribute. I'm really interested in this. I'm going to jump on. So rather than creating a project team where you delegate you, and you're going to do this because we want these functions, rather you say, I've got this really great project. I'm really keen on it. It's very interesting. It's exciting. These are, and somebody says, yeah, I think you're going to need this that I can provide. I think you're going to need some of that I can provide. And people jump on. So UCAP-style collaboration as opposed to BA-style teams. Essentially, UCAP leaders' roles are not instrumental. They are environmental. Contemporary leadership, you see, is all about enabling an engaging and conducive environment where you can bring people together to create shared experiences in which an alternative future for your organization becomes possible. Let me say that again. Contemporary leadership is all about enabling an engaging and conducive environment where you can bring people together to create shared experiences in which an alternative future for your organization becomes possible. So contemporary leaders are concerned with creating such an environment in which its members can learn, they can prosper, they can grow, they can achieve their personal aspirations, and individually contribute to enacting the organization's sustained effects throughout its social, material, and natural environments. Now you'll notice that in that last sentence there, I said sustained effects. These are decidedly not the organization's vision. Effects different than vision. In fact, I have a big problem with this whole vision thing anyway. We talk about vision, everybody's got a vision, every organization's got a vision, every department, every team has a vision. Kept consultants busy and well-paid and well-fed for decades. The organization's vision, right? It's the thing that gets laminated in card, handed out to all the employees. We often have them posted in bronze in the lobby wall. Fortunately, we don't here at Adler. If we did, I would take it down and stomp on it. But we still have visions. Sound like a bunch of people like taking peyote or something, magic mushrooms. It's a problem with vision. Vision, if you think about it, as the guiding sensory metaphor for our organizations. Vision is our only sense that operates at a distance. We can see to the stars. And in fact, if your nose is pressed up against anything, you can't see it at all, right? You need to have some distance and separation to get, perspective. Right? Another vision word. Perspective, you know what perspective is, right? It's creating the illusion of distance and separation on this, two-dimensional thing. We create this illusion. We so need of separation that we manufacture it to gain perspective. But in a world that is ubiquitously connected and pervasively proximate, we are nothing if not pressed up, nose against nose, body against body, person against person. Throughout the world, we are proximate. So having vision as our guiding sensory metaphor is completely dissonant, completely out of touch with the reality of today's world. When I work with CEOs and leaders and teams and organizations, I'll ask the CEO, so what's your organizational vision? And the CEO will typically sit back and be very expansive and talk about where we see ourselves in the future. And of course, there's a problem with that, right? The future never comes. The future is always in the future. You're never held to the future because it's yet to come, right? Easy out. So I'd say, okay, that's very interesting, your vision. Now tell me about your tactility. They go, my what? I said, your tactility. Whom are you going to touch and how are you going to touch them today? You see, as a guiding sensory metaphor, I suggest that the most appropriate sense to use is our most proximate sense of touch. Whom are we going to touch and how are we going to touch them today? And when I ask that question of leaders, they just go from being very expansive to being very focused. They become very intense and intent and intentional. They lean forward, their eyes get wide, and they're thinking, who are we touching? How are we touching them? And do we intend to touch them in this way? The sustained effects. Therefore, the most important aspect of a UCAP leader is to facilitate the enactment of an organization's tactility. This begins from creating a place of collective values among all the members from which the organization's values emerge. Once we have the values, then indeed we can determine and understand the organization's tactility. That generates a vision if they want to have one, but certainly they understand the organization's purpose. From there, the mission, the goals, the individual tasks all emerge, but not in a functionally decomposed deterministic way, but from each individual autonomously with personal agency in an environment of collective responsibility and mutual accountability. Now, what I'd like you to do is hold all this sort of leadership stuff just to the side for a moment. We'll come back to it. I'll ask you all a question. How many people here in the audience have some sort of leadership, management, supervisory responsibility in your workplace, project management, team management? Like, who has management, supervisory? Great. Keep your hands up. Put them up high so I can see you. Okay. Those of you with your hands up. How many people would say, with your hands up, keep your hand up if you trust the people that work for you? If you trust the people that work for you. That'll be one and down. That's okay. Most of the people still here. Okay, with your hands up. Now, keep your hand up if you also have some systems in place where you can actually check up and make sure people are going to accomplish what they say they're going to accomplish on time, on budget, all that good project management stuff. Do you have formal or informal systems for checking up to make sure stuff's going to get done? Keep your hand up. Terrific. Now, for those of you with your hands still up, let me ask you one last question. If you really trust the people as you say you do, why do you need to check up on them? You can put your hands down. To paraphrase that contemporary philosopher from the 1970s, Eric Siegel, in his seminal work, Love Story, trust is never having to say, so when will it be done? Right? Trust means you don't have to check up. You don't have to make sure. And you do this without abdicating your responsibility or jeopardizing the success of whatever it is you're trying to accomplish. So the challenge for leaders when it comes to trust is to create an environment where trust not only pervades the environment, but is systemically established as a foundational, defining aspect of that environment. That's the challenge. But even before that, how do we understand this elusive quality called trust? How do we understand it? Do we have some sort of model that allows us to talk about trust? The model that I use is sort of an analogy that's sort of fun, is the story of the genie and the lamp. Everybody familiar with the genie and the lamp stories? Right? Everybody familiar with that? Okay, so come back with me. We're going to a far-off time, in a far-off land, in an ancient bazaar, with dark alleyways winding their way, with the tapestry curtains heavy and blocking out the sun. And as we walk through the alleyway, you see the dust, the motes of dusts in the filtered sunlight. And we notice out of the corner of our eye something sort of shiny on the ground, but dusty and dirty. And we reach down and we pick it up. It's a lamp, a brass lamp, a very ancient brass lamp. It's got the right shape and the right size. It's got that the spout and the big curly handle. And we look at it and we think, nah. I mean, what are the chances, right? But we look at it again and go, so what do we do? You rub the lamp. Of course we rub the lamp. Why do we rub the lamp?
Just in case.
Just in case. But why? I mean, where do you get that rubbing the lamp business from?
Stories of the genie who comes out who then
Exactly.
grants you 3 wishes.
Exactly, right? We're familiar with the story. And so when the risk is low, I mean, like, what could happen, right? Like, what are the chances, right? When the risk is low, all we need is familiarity to be able to make what is really a cognitive decision. So think about it in other contexts. You want to buy a new breakfast cereal, right? You go to the store and you see, oh, a new breakfast cereal, and it's from a brand that I'm familiar with. And it's only a few bucks, so take a chance, right? Purely cognitive decision, low risk, all you need is familiarity. Okay, so let's return to the story. You rub the lamp, and as we say in management speak, the lamp meets expectations, and out comes a genie. A genie says, I will grant you a wish, or 3 wishes, depending on your version of the story. And you sort of look at the genie, and you say, is he actually going to grant this wish? Should I make the wish? Should I not make the wish? How much confidence do I have in this particular genie? Confidence is the second level, right? It's based on familiarity and sort of a history of experiences. We gain some confidence because there needs to be a little bit of emotional stake, not a huge stake. The risks aren't all that big, a little bit of risk. But the future is unknowable. Because the future is unknowable, we need to have a level of confidence that will make the unknowable future sort of momentarily certain. It allows us to make that small little emotional hop to actually come to a decision. And so when the risk is sort of medium, not big, not small, but medium, then we combine the familiarity with an emotional sort of connection, and we go for it. Okay. But how do we go for it? Do we make a straight wish or wish with qualifiers? Because you know that expression, be careful what you wish for, right? That came right out of those genie stories because, like, be careful what you wish for. So what do, right? That expression, be careful what you wish for, represents the difference between having confidence and requiring trust. Because there's a paralyzing judgment that goes on in our cognitive process where we don't know and the risk becomes higher and we have to make an unconditional leap of faith. Now we need this trust when the stakes are high. So when there's a high financial cost, we need trust to be able to make that leap. And particularly when the stakes are high relative to us, when our identity is at risk, when our reputation is at risk, when our word is at risk, we need to have trust to make an unconditional leap of faith. And most often we can't quite do that. So what do we do instead? Well, we increase our confidence. We do this by putting in some sort of external control levers. We say, Genie, if you grant me these wishes, I will free you from the imprisonment in the lamp. So a positive motivator, right? Or we may say, Genie, you screw this up and you will never see the princess alive again. So a negative incentive. These are extrinsic motivators, extrinsic motivation, reward and punishment, carrots and sticks, right? So these are things that we do to instill a little more confidence, a little more predictability in the future, a little more stability, a little more control, a little less chance that we're going to have these unavoidable consequences. Heard that before. Oh yeah, over here, BA organizations. BA organizations are great for confidence. They're designed for confidence. All of the constructs of BA organizations increase the confidence of unknowable futures. Right? They increase the amount of control that we have over something that by definition we cannot control. So it creates an illusion of control, just like you can control genies, right? But they're really great for instilling confidence, which is why we have so many funky management decisions, because they're overconfident. But the one thing that a BA organization can never ever get to is trust. There can be no trust in a BA organization. For that, you need a UCAP organization. Now, it may have become obvious to you, I've done this talk before. I've seen audiences before. And when I get to this point in the talk, I know what's going on in some of your heads. I absolutely know it. I'm not a mind reader, but I know. You're sitting there saying, sounds great, Mark. Love the ideas. But, you know, I got responsibilities. I have key performance objectives. I have performance reviews coming up. I have my responsibility. I have my job. I have my reputation. I have my salary, my mortgage, my kids. My confidence is just fine with me. I got stuff to do. And I hear you. I'm not judging. I've taken the coach training here. I don't judge. I'm not judging. I hear you. I empathize. I understand. When your reputation is on the line, when your identity is on the line, when your sense of self is on the line, you need to have trust. You need to make the unconditional leap of faith. I get it. But if you're going to sit there and tell me for 1 second that has anything at all to do with getting stuff done, well, I've got a story for you. Go back to when I started my PhD in the Department of Adult Education and Counseling Psychology at OISE, just down the street over here. Over there, I guess. Or is it that way? Whatever. The year I started my PhD there, we got a new chair in the department. I'm not one of those chairs, but like the chair of the department, right? New chair happened to be my supervisor, Marilyn Lakin. Some of you may know her. Marilyn Lakin is one of the world's leading experts on organization development. And the department was sorely in need of some OD, not overdose, organization development. And she had a few trepidations about taking on this role, but she decided in taking it on that she would approach her, at least initial part of her term as chair, as an action research project, like a good OD practitioner. And so what she did was she interviewed the staff, and she interviewed the faculty, and she interviewed groups of students to find out what the issues were in the department, so sorely in need of organization development. And together with a research assistant, not me, somebody else, they did the data analysis, and they found 6 emergent themes, good grounded theory, 6 themes of the issues that pertain to the department. Then they organized a retreat day. And the retreat day was off-site. It was a full day. Again, invited staff and faculty, groups of students, whoever could make it, to come, and it was organized World Cafe style, a conversation cafe, like what we did for developing our program here. So there were several rounds with facilitating questions, and people drew on the paper on the table, and you shifted around with each question, and it was a really great day. And at the end of that day, which is the only time I use that cliche, not in a cliche form, at the end of that day, the end of the day, we ended up with 6 lists of initiatives, one corresponding to each of the issues, one list corresponding to each of the issues. It was great. Marilyn then stood up and she said, now I'd like each group to appoint a champion, not to take responsibility for those lists of initiatives, but to coordinate the activities among the members of the group. You know that sound in cartoons of brakes screeching to a halt? You could hear that in the room. People stood up and said, are you nuts? Projects? You want us to do projects? Are you crazy? We have increased student loads, higher supervision requirements, greater reporting requirements to the deans. We have to go out and find more research money, and now you want us to do projects on top of this? Forget it. Well, Marilyn, being the good OD consultant that she is, was a bit taken aback, but she persisted, and she said, well, does this mean that the entire day was a waste? Did we not accomplish anything of value here? Those of you who are OD practitioners can recognize that little gambit. And people said, oh, no, 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 it was really worthwhile. We really enjoyed it. We understand the issues. We understand what we need to do. We're just not going to do any projects. Marilyn gave it one more shot. And she said, well, should we do this again in the future sometime? And people said, oh, yeah, let's get together 6 months from now. And we'll get together. We'll see, where we are, where we're at, and, but don't expect any projects. So 6 months passes. And the graduate assistant organizes another retreat. This time it was on site, the Peace Lounge we had on the 7th floor. Actually, still have it on the 7th floor. Peace Lounge, beautiful environment. Set it up again, cafe style, with the tables and the paper and the markers and little candles and the refreshments and stuff. It was a half day. And the staff and the faculty and the students came. And just before it was about to start, the graduate assistant decided that she was going to take 5 minutes, right? Ask what, if anything, had been accomplished. It should only take 5 minutes, because after all, nobody was doing projects. 45 minutes later, we were still hearing all the reports of all the stuff that had been done in 6 months. But it was amazing. These were not just trivial projects. No, no. This was like a new communication strategy for the entire department, new certificate programs, new research centers, new ways of acculturating adjunct faculty into the culture of the department, new landing processes for students who land in this department and get swamped with the graduate work. I mean, major stuff. And as I was sitting there listening to all of these reports of all of these projects that weren't going to get done, right? I was sitting there thinking that had we appointed these champions, nothing would have been done, because people would have been waiting for the champion to call the coordinating meetings, do all the conventional stuff. But Because no one was in charge, everyone was in charge. The other thing that I've realized is that something magical had happened on that retreat day. Something very magical and very special happened on that retreat day. Our organization had somehow, by genie magic, been transformed from a BA organization to a UCAP organization. And I had to know the reason why. So that is, I think, the most interesting of the questions that have come up tonight. How do we convert from a BA organization to a UCAP organization? What is that magic? Because last time I checked, there were no lamps laying around on the 7th floor of Oise. So how do we approach this problem? Well, remember way back at the beginning of my talk, I said that the models we construct are not only descriptive, they're generative. They actually generate the systems that restructure our environment, our society and stuff. So it occurred to me that if I could come up with a new model that accounts for both BA and UCAP organizations simultaneously, where the model itself is consistent with the UCAP world, then that should give me a clue as to the mechanism that went on here. Make sense? Like, it's just crazy enough that it might work. So, what are the characteristics of the UCAP world? We're ubiquitously connected and pervasively proximate. Pervasively proximate is the effect of being, so we look at effects. That's cool so far. And when we're proximate with anybody, when we're next to everybody, we're in some sort of relationship. That sounds sort of good. So I asked, are there a small number of relationships that actually allow us to create organization? Some sort of relationships that allow us to bind or unite, or react or interact with people. It turns out that those words bind, unite, react, interact, combine, the word that describes that is valence. Now you may remember that, for those of you who took high school chemistry, if you remember back that far, the word valence was used to describe the top layer of electrons in the atom that came together to form the molecule. The valence electrons made molecules, allowed them to join together, and I thought, that's a cool metaphor. So we have, maybe, some valence relationships. Relationships that allow people to come together and combine, unite, react with each other. So I went back to the data, and went to the literature, and did all that stuff, and found that there are five valence relationships. Here they are. We have an economic relationship. That's exchange of value that may or may not involve money. There's a socio-psychological relationship. That is the affective connections that when we're working together, right? How you feel about it. There is a knowledge relationship. That's the relationship, not just of exchanging information, but experiences, insights, wisdom, opportunities, right? Knowledge relationship. There is an identity relationship. How we construct our identity, our sense of self in relation to others in the organization. How the organization constructs its sense of self and identity in relation to the individuals. And finally, there is an ecological relationship that recognizes that organizations do not form in the void of space, but are literally grounded, if you will, in exchange of energy with both the natural and built environments. So you have these five relationships. And I define organization as that emergent entity resulting from two or more people, or two or more organizations, or combinations of both, that share multiple valence relationships among their component elements at any point in time. So what this means is organization is emergent. It's contingent. In other words, when you ask, who's a member of the organization, the answer is always, it depends. Right? It's not just the people who are on the payroll, not just the people who come to a particular building or log on to a particular computer terminal every day. It has to do with how you exchange information, how you exchange value, how you exchange identity. So for example, who is a member of any arbitrary university? Well, you could argue that you have like core faculty, tenured faculty, or tenure track faculty, and full-time students. They're members of the organization. But then you also have adjunct faculty and part-time students and continuing ed students. They're also part, but in a different context. But then you have your alumni, and you have your sponsors, and you have, you know, the community that the organization is located in, and they're also members of an organization. So when you say, who is a member of the university? What does this organization look like? It depends on the context in which the question makes sense, defined by these valence relationships. So as I was doing my work, a good PhD researcher, I was questioning, you know, is this thing a valence relationship or is it not? And I got stuck with what I call the problem of knowledge. And it was Peter Drucker. Everybody familiar with the name Peter Drucker, management guru? Peter Drucker, who can either be thanked or blamed, I'm sort of in the latter camp of the blame, for this abomination called the knowledge economy. He came up with that idea back in the 1950s. And I can't really blame him. He didn't have any better language. But what he said, and I'm paraphrasing, he said that knowledge is at once the input commodity, the transforming process, and the output product of knowledge workers in a knowledge economy. And I thought, well, does that mean that knowledge is a commodity like any of the other primary commodities? Do knowledge workers produce knowledge in the same way that steel workers produce steel, and coal workers produce coal, lumber workers produce lumber, boat workers produce boats, and all the rest? Is it merely an instance of economic valence in my terms? Because if it is, well, that means I lose one of my valences. But it didn't seem that way, because when I think back to that story of the adult ed retreat stuff, what we exchanged there was knowledge. That was knowledge, and it did something else. It created this environment of, I don't know, like a common, just a common sensibility, common values. There's a common volition to action that everybody got. That was also part of knowledge. So I was sort of going back and forth. I couldn't quite figure this out. So I did like any great contemporary grad student. I posted on my blog and said, have you got a word for this? I got a bunch of responses. One of them was from Pam. And Pam, to whom I shall be eternally grateful. She gets an acknowledgement in my dissertation. I'm that grateful to Pam. Pam's asked the question, says, have you ever looked at the concept of ba from the Nakan Takeuchi? Nakan Takeuchi wrote this great book called The Knowledge Creating Company. And in it, they describe ba. Japanese word. It's the suffix form of the word basho. Basho means place. And they talk about the place in which knowledge is created and transformed from tacit to explicit and back from explicit to tacit and goes around and around. They had a really nice model. It's actually a cool book if you're into knowledge management. And I looked at it and I said, close but no cigar, but where did they get it from? Where they got it from was a philosopher by the name of Nishida Kito. And Nishida, a Japanese philosopher, lived in the latter part of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century, the Zen philosopher, the founder of the Kyoto School of Philosophy. Nishida was the first philosopher that combined Zen with the Western philosophical traditions, the German philosophers mostly. And he said, and I'm going to get all Zen on you here, so be prepared, in the space of absolute nothingness, self will recognize other and combine to annihilate each. And in its place we have basho, the place of common values, common sensibility, common understanding, and common volition to action. And I went, wow, that's it! That's exactly what I'm looking for. Knowledge has two aspects. There is a tradable or fungible aspect to knowledge. And there is also this ba aspect to knowledge that we generated in that retreat day. And so as a good researcher, I went back and said, if there's a fungible and ba aspect to the knowledge valence, are there fungible and ba aspects to the other valence relationships? Back to the data I went, and sure enough, I found them. And more importantly, what I discovered was that if you have an organization that is expressed primarily or predominantly in terms of its fungible valence relationships, you get a ba organization. And if you have an organization that is expressed primarily or predominantly in terms of its ba form of the relationships, you get a UCAP organization. And so, as these ba form relationships become more pervasive as an organization transforms, and interact with each other in more complex ways. The organization develops the sense of collaborative community, common sensibility, common values, common understanding, common volition to action. It is a unity and coherence that I call organization ba. It is this place of organization as it transforms to become more UCAP that gives us these attributes of when no one is in charge, everyone is in charge. The idea of individual autonomy and agency. The idea of collective responsibility, mutual accountability. Conditions that allow us indeed to have trust in what's going on. Trust in each other. That elusive quality of trust in an organization. So, how do you do it? How do you transform from BA to UCAP? It's very simple. All you do is you take your valence relationships, transform each of them from fungible to BA form, and Bob's your uncle. Simple, right? Easy peasy. Not so easy peasy, right? And so someone might ask the question, so are there any best practices that have to do with transforming? Wrong answer. Best practices, Frederick Taylor, 100 years ago, industrial age, doesn't count. No best practices. Sorry. However, there are a couple of things that every organization does in its own unique way that are common among those organizations that have successfully transformed from BA to UCAP. Let me share those with you. First, all these organizations have created a venue of culture change. And what this is a piece of their business. It may not be the main line of their business, but it's a piece that's important to their day-to-day, whatever they're doing, in which the people get to enact the new behaviors, the new ways of interacting that sort of exercise the new culture as they want it to become. So in the case of the ad agency, for example, they did this thing with a game board. They actually created a game board with all the moves that they wanted to make all the way around the game board. They had particular players. A couple players were common to each one. They used the language of an owner and a customer. Those are the two key players. And then co-collaborators as the other players. They had required moves. They had permitted moves. They had forbidden moves. If you did a forbidden move, you were out of the game, quite literally, because these are behaviors that would just be verboten in the company. And they fired their president. The CEO fired the president for playing the forbidden moves one too many times. And what they did was they created this new language, and in this venue there was no hierarchical status. Wearing your status was one of the forbidden moves. Collaboration, emergent leadership, all those sorts of things. Right? That was the context in which the admin assistant was the leader. And so during my research, I went to New York a couple times, and one of my visits there was on a research visit. They had initiated this really great program. They did a lot of work in the pharma industry, and they were working with an organization, a pharmaceutical company, that had just introduced a new medication for type 2 diabetes. And they wanted to have an educational program that went along with the people who were prescribed this medication. And so the organization decided that they wanted to see what it really was like to live as a type 2 diabetic. So they decided that for 3 months, whoever wanted to would live as a type 2 diabetic. The diet, the exercise, the lifestyle changes, educational programs, had a great ad campaign within the company. About 60% of the company participated in this. And so when I got there, I said, so do you have a game board for this initiative? They said, well, no, maybe we should. And what I realized, of course, was that the disciplines of the culture change venue had become so commonplace, it just pervaded the rest of the organization and just became the way things have always been, the way we just do stuff around here. Culture change venue. Another example, this is not from my research, but it was a colleague who was doing a knowledge management research and also using the concept of BA in the Brazilian Institute for Sugarcane Research. Did you know there was such a thing? That was a knowledge-based organization. You want to talk about knowledge-based, that was all about knowledge about Brazilian sugarcane stuff. And in that organization, quite literally, knowledge was power. If you had the knowledge, you had the power in that organization. And so it was a knowledge hoarding organization. And people hoarded knowledge because they were powerful. And they wanted to change this culture. So the culture change venue that they created was every 6 weeks they had an academic-style conference where people who had the knowledge were given a red carpet and they were feted and they shared their knowledge. And soon it became very desirable to share the knowledge. People became recognized for this. And over a very short period, relatively short period of time, they transformed from a knowledge hoarding culture to a knowledge sharing culture. Which gives us the second thing that all of these organizations do. And that is they attack the identity valence first. Identity valence is our strongest valence connection. People think we're motivated by money. We're not. We're motivated by identity, our sense of self, right? And so what the Brazilian Sugarcane Institute, or the Research for Sugarcane Research did was they created an opportunity for people to go from fungible identity, where identity had tradable value, to the Ba form of identity about creating great environment. And once you can shift the identity, the risk goes away. You know this resistance to change we hear all about? Whenever you hear resistance to change, add two more words. Resistance to change in identity. If you can figure out how to get the identity over to the Ba form, the risk is lowered. With lower risk, we increase trust. And therefore, we can then transform the rest of the valence relationships, and Bob is indeed your uncle. That's how it's done. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the power of trust in action. It is the trust to rethink our models that generate our teams and our organizations. It is the trust to create new conceptions of what it means to lead in our contemporary world and to be a leader in these organizations. And as leaders, it facilitates the trust necessary to create new enabling frameworks to allow us to meet the extremely complex challenges, not only of our organizations, not only of our local societies, but of our UCAP world in general. Thank you very, very much.